A single mother named Renee Carter sat on the bathroom floor of a cramped apartment in Ohio, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her phone. Her baby, 6-month-old Noah, was crying in the next room, hungry, and the formula can on the counter was empty. She had $11 to her name. In desperation, she scrolled through her contacts, found the name Danny, and typed a message begging for $200 until payday. She hit send without checking the number twice. Only after the message disappeared into the blue bubble did she realize her hands had shaken enough to misdial. The message hadn't gone to her cousin Danny. It had gone to a stranger. And within 4 minutes, that stranger replied, and nothing in Renee's life would ever be the same again. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who believes small mistakes can crack open enormous secrets, hit subscribe right now, tap that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because this story, this real, raw, unbelievable story, is about to take you somewhere you won't expect. Renee had not always been this desperate. 3 years earlier, she had a husband, a modest home, and a nursery painted the color of soft sunrise yellow. Marcus Carter had been a quiet man, careful with his words, the kind of man who checked the locks twice before bed. Not out of fear, but out of habit, as if some old instinct never let him rest completely. He worked long hours at a logistics company downtown, came home smelling like diesel and coffee, and always kissed Renee's forehead before he kissed her lips. She used to tease him about it. "You kiss my forehead like I'm your daughter," she'd laugh, and he'd only smile, that same tired, guarded smile he wore whenever the past almost slipped out of him, and he swallowed it back down. Marcus never talked about his life before Renee. When she asked, he'd change the subject, or kiss her, or simply say, "That man doesn't exist anymore." She let it go, because love sometimes means not needing every answer. But 16 months ago, everything unraveled. Marcus left for what he called a job in Cleveland and never came home. The official story, delivered by 2 police officers standing stiffly in her doorway, was a car accident. Single vehicle, black ice, no witnesses. Renee had nodded, signed papers, buried her husband in a cheap casket because that's what the small life insurance covered, and told herself the story was true because the alternative was unthinkable. But something in her gut never accepted it. Marcus didn't drive on unfamiliar roads at night. He was too careful. He mapped every route twice. And there was the way his phone had been wiped clean before the funeral. Every photo, every message, gone, as if someone had reached into his life and erased him before she even had the chance to grieve properly. She buried the questions along with him because she had a baby to feed and a world that didn't wait for widows to heal. Which brings us back to that bathroom floor, that empty formula can, and that one wrong text message that slipped through the cracks of a broken cousin's old phone number, a number that had been recycled, resold, and reassigned to a man named Damian Cross. Damian Cross was not a man people crossed twice. At 44, he ran an empire that stretched from freight shipping to real estate to enterprises far less legal, all buried under layers of legitimate paperwork, so clean that federal agents had tried and failed to touch him for over a decade. Men feared him not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. He spoke softly, made decisions quickly, and when someone betrayed him, there was no shouting, no scene, just silence. And then that person was simply gone. His inner circle called him the Ghost because he had a way of disappearing from rooms before anyone noticed he'd left and appearing in places no one expected him to be. That night, Damian was in his penthouse office on the 40th floor, staring at a spreadsheet of numbers that meant nothing to him emotionally, but everything to him strategically, when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Danny, please, I'm sorry to ask again, but I need $200 for Noah's formula. I'll pay you back Friday, I swear. I just can't let him go hungry tonight, please." Damian frowned. He did not know a Danny. He did not know a Noah. This was, without question, a wrong number, the kind of mistake that happened 100 times a day to 100,000 phones and meant nothing. Except Damian Cross read it 3 times. There was something in the phrasing. "I can't let him go hungry tonight. Not, I need money. Not, please help." The desperation was specific, physical, a mother staring at an empty can, a crying child in the next room. Damien had grown up harder than anyone in his organization knew. Before the suits, before the buildings with his name quietly attached to shell corporations, there had been a two-room apartment in Newark where his own mother had once walked 6 blocks in the snow to beg a store owner for expired bread. He remembered the taste of powdered milk stretched too thin. He remembered hunger in a way that never fully left a person, no matter how many zeros accumulated in a bank account. He typed back 4 words. Wrong number. But wait. Renee stared at her screen, her heart sinking. Of course it was wrong. Of course the universe wasn't going to hand her a miracle on a bathroom floor. She started typing an apology, embarrassed, ready to lock her phone and figure out some other way. Maybe the pastor of the church 2 blocks over. Maybe another humiliating call to her sister who was already stretched thin herself when 3 dots appeared. Someone was typing. Send me the app you use to receive money. I'll send $200 anyway. By the formula. Renee blinked at the screen like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. She glanced at her son's door, where Noah's cries had softened into exhausted hiccups. I don't understand, she typed. You don't know me. No, but you needed help, and I was the accident that received the message. Call it fate, call it luck, doesn't matter. Send the info. Something about the bluntness of it. No flattery, no strange requests, no what do you look like, made Renee's guard lower just slightly. She sent her payment app username with shaking fingers, half expecting a scam, half expecting silence. Within 90 seconds, her phone buzzed with a notification. $200 received. She sat on that bathroom floor and cried. Not from sadness this time, but from a kind of disbelief the world rarely offers people like her. A stranger's mistake had become her miracle. Thank you, she typed, tears blurring the screen. You have no idea what this means. I'll pay you back, I promise. You don't owe me anything. Go feed your son. Renee assumed that would be the end of it. A strange kindness from a strange man. A story she'd tell no one because no one would believe it. A small light in an otherwise dark year. She bought the formula that night, fed Noah until he fell asleep with milk still on his lips, and finally slept for the first time in days without the gnawing terror of tomorrow eating at her chest. But 3 days later, her phone buzzed again. Did the formula help? Renee stared at the message for a long moment. Most strangers who sent money to fix a crisis disappeared afterward. Their good deed complete, their conscience satisfied. This one was checking in. Yes. Thank you again. I really don't know how to repay you. You don't need to repay kindness. But I am curious. How does a mother end up alone, asking a stranger for baby formula money? If you don't want to answer, that's fine too. Renee hesitated over the keyboard for a long time. She could have lied, could have said something vague and safe. Instead, something about the anonymity of it. A man she'd never see on the other end of the phone who owed her nothing and asked for nothing, made her want to tell the truth for the first time in over a year. My husband died 16 months ago. Car accident, they said. I've been barely holding on since. I lost my job when I had to take time off for the funeral and the baby. I'm behind on everything. I don't have family close by who can help much. I just didn't know what else to do that night. There was a long pause on the other end. Long enough that Renee assumed she'd overshared, that she'd scared away her strange benefactor with too much reality. Then his response came. I'm sorry for your loss. What was his name? Marcus. Marcus Carter. Miles away, in a penthouse office with dimmed lights and a view of the city, he quietly controlled more than anyone realized. Damien Cross went completely still. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed at the screen. For a full 30 seconds, he did not type anything at all, because the name Marcus Carter was not a stranger's name to him. It was a name buried in a file he had personally ordered sealed 18 months ago. It was a name connected to a warehouse fire, a missing shipment, and a betrayal that had cost Damien nearly everything he'd built. A betrayal he believed he had put to rest. Marcus Carter was supposed to have disappeared quietly into witness protection under a different identity after the deal went wrong. Damien had made sure of it personally. He had pulled strings, made calls, protected a man whom many in his organization wanted dead for what he'd done. And now that man's widow was texting him about baby formula, completely unaware that the man who saved her son from starvation 3 nights ago was the very man her husband had once betrayed, and the very man responsible, whether directly or not, for the danger that ultimately caught up to Marcus on that icy road. Damien's fingers hovered over the phone. Whatever he chose to say next would decide everything. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he finally typed, each word measured, careful, hiding a storm underneath. "That's a hard thing for a family to carry." "It is. Some days, I still expect him to walk through the door." "Sorry, that probably sounds crazy to a stranger." "It doesn't. Grief doesn't need to make sense to anyone but the person carrying it." Renee smiled faintly at her phone, alone in her dim living room, unaware that on the other end, a man who held immense power over life and death in this city was recalculating every move he was about to make, because the accident of a wrong number had just placed him face to face, digitally, at least, with the family of a man whose death he had never fully explained to himself, let alone to her. Over the following 2 weeks, the messages continued. Not daily, but often enough that Renee began, almost embarrassingly, to look forward to them. Damien never asked for anything. He never made her feel like she owed him conversation in exchange for his charity. He asked about Noah's laugh, about the small victories of parenting alone, about the tomato plant she was trying to keep alive on her windowsill despite having no gardening experience whatsoever. In turn, without meaning to, Renee found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone since Marcus died. Not to her sister, not to her coworkers, not even fully to herself. She had no idea she was confiding in the very architecture of the danger that had orphaned her son. Damien, for his part, found himself doing something he hadn't done in over a decade, caring about the outcome of a stranger's day. He told himself it was guilt. He told himself it was simply making sure the widow of a man he'd once protected was surviving, a final act of quiet penance before he closed that chapter permanently. But there were nights he caught himself smiling at his phone over some small, ordinary thing Renee had said. Noah discovering his own feet, a neighbor's dog destroying her mailbox, the absurd guilt of eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row, and he realized the smiling wasn't strategic. It was real, and that terrified him more than any rival gang or federal investigation ever had. 3 weeks after the first message, Renee received a knock on her door that would change everything. It wasn't Damien. She had no address to give him even if she'd wanted to, and some invisible boundary had kept their entire relationship confined to text and intimacy without faces. Instead, standing on her cracked concrete step was a woman in a gray coat, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, holding a manila folder against her chest like a shield. "Renee Carter?" the woman asked. "Yes. My name is Detective Sarah Whitlock. I worked your husband's case 18 months ago. Do you have a few minutes? There's something about Marcus's accident I think you deserve to know." Renee's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "I was told it was closed," she said carefully, one hand still gripping the doorframe. "A quel accident. Black ice." Detective Whitlock's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes flickered. The look of someone who had spent a year and a half unable to say something out loud, finally given permission to try. "That's what the report says," Whitlock said quietly. "It's not entirely what I believe happened. Can I come in?" Renee's hands were shaking again, the same way they had shaken over that formula weeks earlier. Except this time the hunger wasn't for milk. It was for the truth she had buried alongside her husband, the truth she had told herself didn't matter because digging it up wouldn't bring him back. She stepped aside and let the detective in. Whitlock sat at the small kitchen table, placing the folder down but not opening it yet, as if she needed to build up to whatever was inside. "Your husband wasn't just a logistics manager, Mrs. Carter," she said. "Not fully. 18 months ago, he came to me, to the department, with information about a shipping operation tied to organized crime. Money laundering through freight companies. He said he wanted out, wanted to protect his family, and he was willing to talk in exchange for protection." Renee's mouth went dry. "That's not. Marcus wasn't involved in anything like that. He worked in an office. He came home every night at 6. He worked in an office for a company that was a front," Whitlock said gently. "I believe your husband got pulled into something years before you two even met, tried to walk away quietly, and when that wasn't enough, try to make it right by coming to us. We were building a case. And then, 3 days before he was supposed to give a formal statement that would have exposed several very powerful people, his car went off Route 9 in the middle of the night, on a stretch of road with no ice reported by any other agency that week. The room tilted slightly around Renee. Are you telling me someone killed him? I'm telling you I was never allowed to finish that investigation, Whitlock said, and for the first time, real frustration cracked through her composed exterior. The case was closed from above. Evidence went missing. I was reassigned. I've sat on this for a year and a half because I had nothing solid enough to bring to anyone who would listen. But 3 days ago, something changed. She finally opened a folder and slid a single photograph across the table. Renee stared down at it, and the blood drained from her face. It was a grainy surveillance still, time-stamped from years earlier, showing 2 men shaking hands outside a warehouse. One of them, younger, nervous-looking, was unmistakably Marcus. The other man, standing with the quiet authority of someone who owned the room without needing to raise his voice, was a face Renee had never seen in person, but a face she now realized, with a cold wave of nausea, she had been trusted, admired, and quietly falling for through nothing but a screen. Do you know this man? Whitlock asked, watching Renee's expression carefully. Renee's phone buzzed in her pocket at that exact moment. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She looked anyway. The message on the screen read simply, "How was Noah's checkup today?" Renee stared at the photograph, then at her phone, then back at the photograph, the room spinning as 2 separate realities she had kept in different corners of her mind suddenly collided into one impossible, horrifying truth. "His name," she whispered, barely able to form the words, "is Damien Cross. Isn't it?" Detective Whitlock went very still. "How do you know that name?" she asked slowly. Renee didn't answer. She couldn't. Because the man in the photograph, the man connected to her husband's final, fatal decision, the man possibly responsible for turning her into a widow and her son into a boy who would grow up never knowing his father, was the same man who had spent 3 weeks quietly, tenderly, becoming the first person to make her feel less alone since the day Marcus never came home. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse office with a view of a skyline he ruled from the shadows, Damien Cross had just received a notification that a name he'd buried in old case files was active again. A detective's name, requesting access to sealed records that were supposed to have disappeared forever. He set down his phone slowly, his jaw tightened, and for the first time in a very long time, Damien Cross felt something close to fear. Because the woman he'd been falling for without permission, the widow he told himself he was simply watching over out of guilt, was about to learn exactly who he was. And there would be no wrong number, no accident, no misunderstanding to soften what came next. Renee sat frozen at her kitchen table, the photograph trembling between her fingers, while 3 feet away her phone lit up again with another gentle, ordinary text from the very man in that photograph. "Renee? Everything okay? You usually answer by now." Detective Whitlock leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to tell me exactly how you know that name. Right now." Renee's throat felt like it was closing. "He's been texting me. For 3 weeks. He sent me money the night I couldn't afford formula. It was a wrong number. He wasn't even trying to reach me. I thought." She stopped, horrified at how naive the words sounded out loud. "I thought he was just a kind stranger." Whitlock's face went through something complicated, surprise, calculation, and then a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Damien Cross does not send strangers money by accident, Mrs. Carter. Men like him don't have accidents. They have opportunities they decide to take. You think this was planned?" Renee's voice cracked. "He didn't know me. He couldn't have known that number would end up." "I don't know what he knew," Whitlock admitted. "But I know he's not careless, and I know your husband's death sits at his feet whether his hands pulled the trigger or not. I need you to stop responding to him until I understand what's happening here." Renee looked down at her phone one more time, at the small, waiting cursor beneath his last message, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she didn't know what to type back. She set the phone face down on the table like it might burn her, and looked up at the detective with eyes that had aged years in the span of 10 minutes. "Tell me everything," she said. "All of it. I don't care how ugly it is anymore. If this story has your heart racing already, That's exactly why you need to comment right now and tell me. Do you think Damien is protecting Renee or hunting her? Like this video if this story is already getting under your skin, because what happens next will change everything you think you understand. Whitlock exhaled slowly, as if she'd been waiting a year and a half for someone to finally ask her to say it all out loud. 3 years ago, Marcus worked logistics for a freight company called Halloran Shipping, she began. On paper, a legitimate business. Underneath, a laundering pipeline from money tied to Cross's operation. Not drugs, not the things people assume when they hear organized crime, but something quieter. Real estate fraud, shell corporations, freight manifests padded with cargo that didn't exist. Marcus started as a low-level manager who didn't ask questions. Then he started asking questions. Because of me, Renee whispered. We just found out I was pregnant with Noah. Whitlock nodded slowly. That's what he told the agent who first made contact with him. He said he had a kid coming, and he didn't want that kid growing up with a father who was quietly complicit in something rotten. He reached out to the Bureau first, not local police. I only got pulled in later as a liaison because of jurisdiction. He agreed to wear a wire on 2 meetings. The second one was with Cross himself. Renee felt sick, and Cross found out. That's the part one could never prove, Whitlock said, frustration bleeding into her voice again. Because 3 days after that second meeting, Marcus was dead. The wire recordings from that meeting were wiped from Bureau servers, which should be impossible, and my direct supervisor pulled me off the case within 48 hours with no real explanation. Somebody with serious reach made this go away. I always assumed it was Cross protecting himself. Assumed, Renee repeated. You're not sure. Whitlock hesitated, and that hesitation said more than her next words did. There's a version of this where Cross had him killed to protect his empire. And there's a version I've never been able to rule out, where Cross tried to protect Marcus and someone underneath him, someone who stood to lose more if that case went forward, took matters into their own hands instead. Renee's mind raced back through 3 weeks of late-night messages, small kindnesses, a man who asked about a tomato plant, and a baby's laugh instead of demanding anything in return. None of it made sense next to the image of a man capable of ordering a father dead on an icy road. Her phone buzzed again, face down on the table, the vibration sounding unbearably loud in the silence of the kitchen. Whitlock's eyes flicked to it. Don't answer that. But Renee, against every ounce of caution the detective was trying to instill in her, turned the phone over anyway. I know something's wrong. Please tell me Noah's okay. There was something in the immediacy of it, the worry threaded through 4 short words, that made Renee's resolve waver in a way she hated herself for. He sounds scared, she murmured, almost to herself. He should be, Whitlock said grimly. Because somebody just resurrected a case he thought was buried, and men like Damien Cross don't survive as long as he has by leaving threats unaddressed. That night, after Whitlock left with a promise to return in 2 days once she'd secured additional records, Renee sat alone in her darkened living room long after Noah had fallen asleep. Her phone sat on a coffee table, screen dark, for unanswered messages from Damien glowing faintly each time it lit up with a new one. Renee, please, just tell me you're safe. I'll stop messaging if that's what you want. Just tell me that much. I'm not trying to scare you. I never wanted you to find out this way. That last message stopped her breath in her chest. Find out this way. Not find out what. Not confusion. Acknowledgement. He knew exactly what she'd learned, or at least that she'd learned something, which meant he had eyes closer to her life than a stranger 3 weeks deep into text messages should have any right to. Fear, sharp and sudden, replaced the strange tenderness she'd been nursing for weeks. She grabbed the phone. Are you having me watched? The reply came almost instantly, as if he'd been staring at his screen the entire time, waiting. No, but I know when someone starts asking questions about old cases, because I made sure people would tell me if they ever did. That's different from watching you. I need you to believe that difference matters. You knew who I was this whole time, didn't you? From the first message. You knew Marcus's name before I ever said it. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. The digital equivalent of a man choosing his next words the way another might choose which wire to cut on a bomb. I didn't know who you were when I sent that money. I swear that on anything you want me to swear on. I found out 3 days later when you told me his name. And by then, I couldn't stop talking to you because for the first time in a long time, someone was talking to me like I was just a person, not a name people whispered in fear. I know that's not an excuse. I know I should have told you the moment I knew. I was a coward about it. And I'm not a man who gets to be a coward often. Renee stared at the confession, feeling something crack open in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but something more complicated. The horrifying, undeniable sense that his regret was real. Did you kill my husband? The pause this time stretched so long that Renee actually watched the message timestamp change, minutes ticking by in silence. No, the answer finally came. I tried to save him. I failed. And I have spent every day since telling myself that failure wasn't my fault, because the alternative is unbearable. I think you deserve the whole truth, but not over text. Not something this important. Then tell me in person. That's not safe for you right now. Not until I know who else is watching this unravel. I don't care about safe anymore. I buried my husband not knowing the truth. I am done living in the dark, Damien. If you have any decency left in you, you'll look me in the eye and tell me exactly what happened to my son's father. There was a long pause, and then, tomorrow night, I'll send an address. Come alone, please. The address Damien sent the next afternoon wasn't a warehouse or a penthouse or anywhere Renee had imagined a man like him would choose. It was a small, unremarkable diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a bell over the door that jingled too cheerfully for the weight of what was about to happen inside it. Renee left Noah with her sister, lying about where she was going, and drove there with her hands locked at 10 and 2, her mind replaying every warning Detective Whitlock had given her the night before. Don't go alone. Let me be nearby at least. Please, Renee. She'd agreed to that much. Whitlock was parked 2 blocks away, watching, a plainclothes officer sitting 3 booths down inside his backup, though Renee didn't know exactly where. Damien was already seated in the back booth when she arrived, and seeing him in person for the first time after 3 weeks of only words on a screen did something strange to her chest. He looked smaller somehow, more human, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept much more than she had. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly as she slid into the booth across from him. "Don't thank me. Just talk." He nodded, folding his hands on the table like a man preparing to confess to something he'd rehearsed 100 times and still couldn't make easy. "Marcus came to me 18 months ago," he began, voice low enough that only she could hear it over the diner's tired hum. "Not the way you think. He didn't approach me as an enemy. He came to warn me." Renee's brow furrowed. "Warn you about what?" "That someone inside my own organization was using Halloran shipping to move money that had nothing to do with my business. Money tied to something far more dangerous than laundering. Marcus found manifests that didn't match shipments that existed on paper but not in reality. Cash flows that led back to a man named Victor Reyes, my second in command for nearly a decade. Marcus wasn't trying to bring me down. He was trying to protect his own conscience by warning the person he thought could stop it before it got worse. Because he knew if the Bureau found it first, everyone connected would go down together, including people who had nothing to do with Reyes's side deals. Including, eventually, me. So he was trying to help you," Renee said slowly, the horror of it sinking in even as the shape of the truth rearranged itself in her mind. "Not betray you. He was trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation," Damien said. "I told him I'd handle Reyes quietly. I told him to stay silent, stay careful, and let me deal with it internally so he'd never have to be involved in bureau paperwork or federal exposure. I thought I was protecting him, but it didn't work." Damien's jaw tightened, old grief surfacing in a face that clearly wasn't used to showing it. "Reyes found out Marcus had come to me before I could act. He panicked. He decided Marcus was a loose end that could expose everything, including Reyes's own theft from my organization, which was significant enough to get him killed if I ever found the full extent of it myself. So Reyes made the accident happen on Route 9 that night, using 2 men still loyal to him inside my own organization. Men I trusted enough that I never suspected them until 8 months later, when it was far too late to reverse anything. Marcus wasn't killed because of what he told me. He was killed because of what Reyes was terrified he'd already told someone else. Renee's hands were shaking now, the same tremor from that bathroom floor months ago, returning in full force. You knew this. You've known this for 8 months, and you let me believe it was an accident. I dealt with Reyes the way people like me deal with betrayal, Damien said. And something cold moved behind his eyes for just a moment, a glimpse of the man the whole city feared beneath the man who'd been so gentle in text messages. But I couldn't undo what happened to Marcus, and I couldn't walk up to his widow and explain that her husband died, trying to protect a criminal empire from a worse criminal inside it. What good would that have done you? I told myself silence was mercy. It wasn't mercy, Renee said, her voice breaking. It was a lie. I have spent 16 months thinking my husband died because of black ice, when he actually died a hero, warning a man like you to try to fix something, and you let me bury him without ever telling me that. Damien had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that made it smaller than it was. Why now? Renee finally asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Why did you send that money? Why did you keep talking to me for 3 weeks, if this whole time you knew exactly who I was? Because guilt doesn't let you sleep, Damien said quietly. And because somewhere around the 2nd week, it stopped being guilt and started being something I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. I know how that sounds. I know I don't get to want that from you. Not after everything. But I won't sit here and lie to you on top of everything else. The bell over the diner door jingled sharply, and both of their heads turned toward it out of instinct. The man who walked in wasn't a customer. He was tall, calm, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly what kind of room he was walking into. And the moment Damien's face changed, hardening instantly from confession to alert readiness, Renee understood with a sick drop in her stomach exactly who had just found them. Victor, Damien said quietly, not moving from the booth, his voice gone flat and dangerous in a way Renee hadn't heard from him before. I thought you understood we were finished discussing loose ends. Victor Reyes smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, and glanced at Renee with an interest that made her blood run cold. I did understand that, Reyes said smoothly, sliding uninvited into the booth beside Damien, close enough that Renee realized with rising panic he was positioned between Damien and the aisle. Until I heard you'd been quietly resurrecting an 18-month-old case by meeting with the very widow whose silence has kept both of us safe this entire time. That concerns me, Damien. That concerns me very much. Renee's eyes darted toward the front window, toward where she knew Whitlock was supposed to be watching, and felt the first true wave of terror wash over her as she realized the diner had gone strangely, completely empty of any other customers, and the plainclothes officer who was supposed to be 3 booths away was nowhere in sight. Reyes followed her gaze and smiled again, colder this time. Looking for your detective friend? He asked pleasantly. She had a small delay tonight. No sin permanent. Just enough time for the 3 of us to have an honest conversation before anyone comes looking. Damien's hand moved slowly beneath the table, and Renee felt her heart slam against her ribs as she realized the quiet, gentle man who'd spent 3 weeks asking about her son's laughter was now sitting rigid beside a man he clearly considered capable of anything, and she was sitting directly across from both of them with absolutely nowhere to run. Reyes's eyes moved between them, savoring the silence the way a man savors control he doesn't often have to fight for. Here's what's going to happen, he said, voice still pleasant, still terrifyingly calm. Mrs. Carter is going to go home to her son. Damien and I are going to finish a conversation we should have finished 18 months ago. And none of this is going to become anyone else's problem. You don't get to decide what happens to her, Damien said quietly. And Renee heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not the gentleness of the messages, not the guarded confession from 10 minutes ago, but something older, harder, a version of him that had survived in this world long before she'd ever known his name. You made your play 18 months ago, Victor. You had a father killed to cover your own theft. I'll let you live because dead men can't return what they stole. That mercy is the only reason you're still breathing. Mercy, Reyes repeated, almost amused. Is that what you call 3 weeks of texting a widow behind my back? Digging through old files? sending a detective sniffing around records that were supposed to stay buried. His eyes flicked to Renee. You should know, Mrs. Carter, that your husband's death wasn't personal. It was business. Unfortunately, it seems his ghost is about to become very personal indeed. Renee's mind was racing, but underneath the terror, something sharpened. A clarity she hadn't expected to find sitting 3 feet from the man who'd ended her husband's life. You're scared, she said, surprising even herself with how steady her voice came out. You're not here because you're in control. You're here because you're afraid of what happens if this comes out now. Reyes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Damien's eyes flicked toward her with something like warning, or maybe something like pride. You should be quiet, Reyes said, the pleasantness thinning at the edges. Why? Renee pressed, some reckless, grief-fueled courage taking hold of her now that she had nothing left to lose. You said it yourself, you're worried about a case being reopened. That's not a man in control. That's a man who knows the money trail still leads back to him even after all this time. What did you take, Victor? What's still missing that you never accounted for? Something shifted in Reyes's expression, a flicker of genuine alarm, quickly buried, but not quickly enough. Damien caught it too, and Renee watched his whole posture change, understanding dawning across his face. You never fully covered it, Damien said slowly, almost to himself. The manifest Marcus found. You never actually finished cleaning that up, did you? You killed him to stop the story from coming out, and then you got greedy again afterward. There's still an open thread somewhere with your name on it. Enough, Reyes snapped, and for the first time his hand moved toward his jacket, and that was the moment the diner door burst open. Detective Whitlock came through first, weapon raised, 2 uniformed officers behind her, and the plainclothes officer Renee had been searching for earlier emerged from the kitchen doorway, where he'd clearly been held at gunpoint by a 4th man Renee hadn't even noticed standing near the counter. Victor Reyes, hands on the table now, Whitlock ordered, voice cutting through the diner like a blade. Reyes froze, calculating, his eyes darting toward Damien as if expecting an ally who wasn't going to appear. You wired me, Reyes said quietly, staring at Damien with something between fury and disbelief. No, Damien said, standing slowly with his hands visible, calm even now. I told the detective where to find you 3 days ago, when I realized you'd start feeling cornered the moment you learned Renee was asking questions. I didn't need a wire, Victor. I just needed you arrogant enough to come find us yourself. And you always were predictable when you felt threatened. It was, Renee would realize much later, the twist she should have seen coming from the very first night he texted her back. Damien hadn't been protecting himself by staying silent about Marcus for 8 months. He'd been quietly building a case against Reyes the entire time, waiting for the right moment, the right proof, the right mistake, and her wrong number had accidentally become the catalyst that finally made Reyes desperate enough to expose himself. The officers moved in, cuffing Reyes as he shouted something about deals and leverage that no one in the room seemed interested in hearing. Whitlock approached the booth, her eyes moving between Renee and Damien with cautious assessment. You all right? She asked Renee. Renee nodded, though her hands were still shaking. You were watching the whole time. Since last night, Whitlock admitted. Mr. Cross came to me yesterday morning, before you and I even spoke again. Gave me records connecting Reyes to falsified manifests and 2 men with priors who match witness description from the night of Marcus's accident. He's been building this case quietly for months, feeding me information through channels that wouldn't expose either of us to Reyes's people. I couldn't tell you until we knew you were safe. Renee turned to look at Damien, 100 emotions crashing into each other at once. Betrayal, gratitude, grief, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. You let me think you were hiding something monstrous, she said quietly. This whole time you were trying to finish what Marcus started. I was hiding something, Damien said. Just not what you thought. I was hiding the fact that for 8 months, the only thing that made any of this bearable was checking on you and your son, and I didn't know how to tell a grieving widow that the man responsible for her husband's death was someone I'd been quietly hunting the entire time, without sounding like I was using your grief to justify my own guilt. If you didn't see that coming, Drop a comment right now telling me which moment made you gasp, because this is exactly the kind of twist that makes rewatching a story worth it. And if stories like this keep you up past midnight, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. 3 weeks later, Renee sat across from Detective Whitlock one final time, this time in a quiet coffee shop instead of her cramped kitchen. Victor Reyes had been formally charged, the falsified manifest finally surfacing as concrete evidence, and 2 of his former enforcers had begun cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. Men who confirmed, in cold official language, exactly what had happened to Marcus on Route 9 that night. "It's not everything," Whitlock said, sliding a folder across the table, considerably thinner than the one she'd first brought to Renee's door. "But it's enough. Enough for the truth to be on record. Enough that someday, if Noah ever wants to know exactly what happened to his father, there will be an answer that isn't a lie about black ice." Renee held the folder for a long moment before opening it, and inside found something she hadn't expected, a handwritten letter, official commendation language stripped away, replaced by something more human. It was from the bureau agent who had originally recruited Marcus, thanking her, posthumously, for her husband's courage, acknowledging formally what had never been said aloud in the 16 months since his death. Marcus Carter had died trying to do the right thing, and the right thing had eventually, finally, been done in return. She cried in that coffee shop in a way she hadn't let herself cry at the funeral, when everything was still numb and unexplained. This time the tears came from somewhere different. Not just grief, but a strange, hard-won peace. Damien didn't disappear after that night in the diner, though he gave Renee space in the weeks that followed, understanding instinctively that she needed room to process a truth that had rearranged 16 months of her life. But he kept texting small things, careful things, asking about Noah, never asking for more than she was willing to give. It was Renee who finally reached out first, nearly a month later, an evening when Noah had fallen asleep early and the apartment felt unusually quiet. "I don't know what we are," she typed. "I don't know if I can build something with the reason my husband is dead standing this close to my life. But I also don't know how to just erase 3 weeks of you being the only person who made me feel like I wasn't drowning alone. I think I need time, but I don't think I need you gone." The reply came slower than usual this time, as if he'd read it more than once before answering. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want you and Noah safe and happy, whatever shape that ends up taking, even if it never includes me the way I might want it to." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Renee would tell you that herself, if you asked her, that love doesn't erase grief, that forgiveness doesn't erase loss, that some truths, even when finally spoken, leave scars that never fully close. But 16 months after burying a husband she thought she'd never truly know the full truth about, Renee Carter finally had something she hadn't had since that night the police first knocked on her door. An answer, a measure of justice, and the strange, unexpected possibility that even the darkest mistakes, a wrong number, a stranger's guilt, a widow's desperation, could crack open into something resembling hope. Noah would grow up never remembering the father who died, try to protect people he'd never even met. But someday, Renee promised herself she would tell him the whole story, not the lie about black ice, but the truth about a good man who chose honesty over safety, and about the impossible, improbable wrong number that eventually, painfully brought that truth home. If this story moved you even a little, let me know in the comments what part hit you hardest, the wrong number, the twist, or the ending. Hit like if you believe some mistakes happen for a reason, and subscribe if you want more stories exactly like this one, because there are so many more waiting to be told.